In this lesson, I just want to go over a few more examples of what you can do in a function. And that's really not limited to anything. You can do any JavaScript inside of a function. But functions are something that you're going to be working with every single day. And I want to make sure that you really understand what it is. So if you don't have a full grasp of what functions are yet, then this video is definitely for you. So in the last video, we created an addition function, and all it did was add two numbers together. Instead, let's go ahead and create a few different other functions. And this is really just for example purposes. These might not be practical in real life, but I just want to show you what they can and cannot do. Or rather, not what they cannot do, just what they are able to do. So remember, you always start with a function keyword. And that's a reserved word, so don't call your variables the word function, because that's going to cause a little bit of a pain in your life as a developer. So this function, let's just call it getName. And this one's not going to take any parameters at all. Now, if we look at our index.html, we have, from a previous lesson, I'm just going to indent this, we have an input field called text field. I'm going to actually change that to name, and name here is what the value is going to be. Actually, I'm going to change that. I don't want a name here. Let's use a real name, a totally real name, John Smith. And just so you can see what this page looks like, all we have is an input field called John Smith. That's the only thing that's visible. Going back to our JavaScript, let's go ahead and get this value. We want to get this name. So we create a new variable, and we want this variable to be local to the function. So we use var name is equal to document.query query selector, and we want to select it by its class name of name. Now, if you remember from a previous lesson, as soon as we select this element, we have access to this entire element. We have access to its inner HTML, which there is none because it's a self-closing tag. We have access to its value, its class, its type, any other properties and attributes that we can give to it. We have access to all of that now. But all we want is the name. So let's change this from name to name element, because that's just the element, the HTML element, and let's get the name as name element.value. So we know that name element is selecting the name element in here, and we're going to grab the value, which matches this property, or this attribute. Cool, so now we have a name. What if we want to mutate that name? What if we want to modify it a little bit? What if we said the last name Smith is too common, and it has to be something else. So if anytime the last name Smith shows up, we automatically replace it. Well, what we can do is we can create a new variable. We're just going to call it new name is equal to name.replace Smith with Tallene. And to run this function, we just run getName. If I refresh this page, absolutely nothing's going to happen. I open up my console and nothing has happened. Now, why is that? Because this function is not returning anything. If we said alert new name, it's going to run this function. It's not going to run this stuff. It recognizes that it's there, but it's not going to run the code until here. So I'm going to go ahead, save that, refresh the page, and I get John Tallene, whoever that might be. But we don't want to alert the name. Nobody uses alerts anymore. So what we want to do is we want to return new name. And instead of just running this function, which it will still run, but we just don't have access to anything yet, we're going to create another variable called current name. And it's going to get the name from that input area. It's going to replace Smith with Tallene, and it's going to give us whatever that name is. So now, if I said console.log current name, refresh the page, I get the current name. That's the name that's in here. So if I went into my index page, change that from John to Caleb, refresh, I now have Caleb Tallene. That's because it's grabbing this value and it's changing Smith to Tallene. But what if we wanted to do more? What if we just wanted to get the first name? We can create another function called getFirstName, and we want to get the entire name first, so we don't need to copy all of this over. We could, but that breaks the principle of don't repeat yourself. Your code should always stay dry, and dry is don't repeat yourself, in case you didn't catch that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is variable name is equal to getName. This name does not conflict with this name at all because they're in different functions. This variable here is completely unaware that anything in here exists. And now we can use the same names over and over again in different functions. And while name ambiguity is sometimes a very difficult thing to work with because some names are just naturally ambiguous, it allows us to use variables like name, a common variable name, over and over again. Now, that's great. We have the name. What happens if we run alert name? I'm going to comment those out and run getFirstName. Save, refresh, and I get the proper name again. Even though the input is Caleb Smith, it turned out to be Caleb Tallene, and that's because it is now running a function inside of a function. Now that's pretty cool, but we only want the first name. So how do we break a string apart into different bits and pieces? Well, we can use split, which will essentially, if we tell it to, break the word based on all the spaces in the string. So variable first name is equal to name.split, and that's all we're going to do. Now, instead of alerting that, this is going to show up better. If I console log this, save, refresh, and this is an array. We can tell because the proto is an array, and there are two pieces to it, Caleb and Tallene, but we only want the first name. Now we know with the array data type, which we learned quite a while ago, that the first one always starts with the index number 0. So what I can do is return first name 0, and that's the first name. Now, again, because I'm returning it, we're not actually getting any information that can be useful. It's being returned, great, but we're not able to access it yet. So again, we create another variable, and do not be afraid to use variables. Variables take up very little memory. It's not a problem. Use as many variables as you need. And we're going to say variable first name is equal to getFirstName. GetFirstName is going to run getName, whatever that returns. So this name is now the new name. We're going to take that name and we're going to split it. We're going to throw it into a variable called firstName, and we're going to only ever return the first part of that name. So this seems like a lot, and really it's just one step at a time. That's all it is. So save, refresh, nothing happens. And that's because it's in this variable. But we haven't done anything with this variable yet. So let's console log the first name, save, refresh. There we go, first name. What happens if I change this to anything else? Save, refresh. It gives us anything else. What happens if we have a lot of different words in here? It's a crazy middle name. Anything else, a lot of different words in here, Smith. That's the name that's currently in there. And it's still only returning that first word. So now you can see that functions are actually quite valuable because it allows us to write this code very easily, and we don't have to write it over and over again. So to summarize how a function works, or how our functions are currently working, is we have a variable. We declared it as firstName is equal to getFirstName function, and that's going to be the value of whatever is returned. So we have step 1 is going to look for step 2, but actually, step 2 would technically be here. Now, while step 2 is running, it's going to try to get this one. So this is step 2.1. And let's marry that up, 2.1. And it's going to return whatever is in here. So 2.2. Now this changes to 2.2 because the name is whatever is returned in here. It's going to execute all this code for you. It's going to return what's in here, throw it into this variable called name. We split it, we return the first value. And now we have two functions that are operating together. And we don't ever have to write this code ever again. Now, if we really wanted to customize this based on any type of input field, we could add a parameter to getName called really anything you want to. But here we're just going to call it class selector. And your parameter name should always be clear. Give them nice, clear names. Even if they're a little bit longer, clearer is better. And in here, we're going to simply add class selector. But now if we run this, it doesn't work. Why? Because getName is looking for the class selector parameter. It doesn't exist. So we add the string in here, which essentially, we just moved it from here to here. That's all we did. If I save this, refresh the page, it still works. But if I select a class that has nothing in it, what's going to happen? Cannot read property value of null. So essentially what it's saying is the query selector that's selecting the name does not exist class somewhere on our page, which obviously is not anywhere in here, returned an empty HTML element. There's nothing in there. So it couldn't perform what it needed to perform. So just be careful with that. So that's essentially how functions can work. If you're still not completely clear on functions, don't get too hung up on them. They are a little bit different to think about. It's a different way of thinking. But over time, you'll get more used to them. And one of these days, or maybe in just a few minutes, your brain's going to click and it's going to go, oh, I know exactly how these work. But just keep at it. It's one of these things that doesn't make sense because we don't really use this in normal human behavior. But as soon as you turn that logical part of your brain on, it gets a lot easier. So that wraps up this lesson. I hope this makes a lot more sense to you. I know we're sort of rushing through functions a little bit. That's mostly because functions are so common. There's no way around them. And so as a programmer, as a web developer, you're going to become very, very familiar with these, whether you like it or not. And it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing to be aware of how functions work. So that wraps up this lesson. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few comments to this file, and you can download this file as well and test it out. I'm going to clean it up and make sure that it's a little easier to understand for you when you're actually reading through this code.